Hello, welcome back to No Me Callo. I won't stay quiet. I'm your host, Jessica Lomelin, and honestly, I'm not really sure how to begin this episode, and maybe that says a lot, because this episode is the one I've been most afraid to record. This final episode is called, If Someone Heard This, They Would Understand Everything, and I think I've lived with the sentence inside of me for much longer than I like to admit. There are things we learn to explain really well. We learn to shape them, how to organize them, how to make them sound coherent, even professional, even strong. But there are other things that don't exist in language. They live in our minds at 2 a.m, in messages we never sent, in conversations we replay over and over again in silence, in the moment right before we say, I'm fine. So this episode is for all of that, for the things that we never really said, for the words that got stuck in our throats, for the times you said, I'm fine, without knowing where to begin telling the truth, for the goodbyes that never had a closure, for the versions of ourselves that did the best they could with what they had. And I want to be honest with you, this episode scares me, because once you say things out loud, you can't pretend you never felt them. So you know what to do. Get comfortable, grab your coffee, your cafecito, your glass of wine, or a cold beer, and get ready to chismear with me. And I want to tell you something about myself, and maybe you'll recognize yourself here too. I've been the strong person for a very long time. The one who fixes things, the one who shows up, the one who holds everything together, the one who listens, the one who knows what to say when everything is falling apart, the one who people turn to when they don't know what to do. And I won't lie, I got really good at it, really good. Professionally, emotionally, humanly. And I learned how to hold other people's pain without letting mine interrupt the moment. And I learned how to say, everything is gonna be okay, even when I didn't feel it inside myself. But what I didn't learn was something just as important, how to hold myself. And there were so many moments in my life when I would leave a difficult conversation, or finish a heavy workday, or hang up a call, and I would sit in silence thinking, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this without breaking. But I didn't say it out loud, because a strong person doesn't say things like that, right? So for a long time, I stayed quiet and just kept living my life. And there are so many things I never said. So today, I'm going to say them here. There were days when I was emotionally exhausted and I still kept functioning. Days when I would wake up with a heavy chest, like I had already cried before opening my eyes. But I would still get ready, still go out, still respond to messages, still show up, and still deliver. And there were moments when I smiled while inside I felt completely drained. Moments when I could be in a meeting, on a call, in an important conversation, and internally feel like I was carrying an invisible weight no one else could see. There were times I said, I'm fine, when I didn't even know what fine meant anymore. Because it wasn't just a lie outwardly. It was also a disconnection inwardly. It was not having the internal space to ask myself, how am I really doing? There were moments when I didn't ask for help. And not because I didn't need it, but because I didn't know how to receive it. Because even when someone said, I'm here for you, a part of me didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know whether to believe it, didn't know whether I deserved it, and didn't know how to let my guard down without feeling like something bad was going to happen. And I think a part of me learned something very early on, that needing things made other people uncomfortable, that having intense emotions was too much, that asking for support could become a burden for others, that if I showed too much pain, I might lose my place in someone's life. And so without realizing it, I started editing myself. I started softening myself. I started shrinking what I felt so I would be easier to receive. I became the person who didn't make things uncomfortable, the person who fixed things, the person who listened, the person who was available even when I had nothing left in me, the strong person, the one who doesn't break, the one who can always handle it. And silence became a form of protection for me. But not a peaceful silence, not the kind of silence to rest, but the kind of silence that holds too much. The silence that keeps you functioning when there is no more space inside. The silence that makes you keep saying, it's okay, while everything inside you is happening all at once. The silence that teaches you to survive without making noise, because making noise once felt dangerous. And the strange part is that from the outside, no one notices it. From the outside, you are functional, responsible, strong, even admirable. But inside, there's a part of you constantly holding your breath, as if at any moment, if you let go of everything you're carrying, something will overflow. And maybe that's why silence becomes so familiar, because it doesn't require explanation. It doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. It doesn't interrupt anyone else's life, but it slowly takes you away from yourself. And one day you realize something just as quietly, that you spent so long being strong that you no longer remember what it feels like not to be. And that is not weakness, that is exhaustion. It's a prolonged survival. It is learning how to exist without taking up too much space. It is learning not to ask for too much, not to feel too loudly, not to need too visibly, and still to keep going. But something inside me started to shift when I realized this. That surviving in silence is not the same as living in peace, and that maybe that version of me that learned to stay quiet in order to survive no longer needs to run my entire life. But silence has a cost, and my body knew it before my mind did. It became someone who no longer noticed when I started caring too much. I just didn't stop. It became the person who functions, the one who responds, the one who fixes things, the one who keeps going. Even when inside I was tired in a way I don't always know how to explain anymore. Insomnia. And not just on nights without sleep, but nights where my mind wouldn't shut off even though my body was already exhausted. And days and nights where I laid thinking about everything I still have to do, everything I held together during the day, and everything I didn't say because there wasn't space to say it. Anxiety. That feeling there is always something more to do, something more to fix, something more I can't let fall apart. And I became an expert at all of that, of not letting anything fall, at showing up even when it costs me, at holding difficult conversations even when I'm completely drained inside. A tiredness that sleep doesn't fix, because I'm not just tired from day-to-day life. I'm tired from holding myself up in silence, from being strong without pause, from functioning without anyone seeing what it costs me. So sometimes I feel irritated and I don't even know why. Small things that used to not move me now feel like too much. One more message, one more expectation, one more conversation I don't have the energy for. And it's not that I've become less patient, it's that I was already carrying too much before that. And I became more sensitive to anything I can no longer hold in silence. That emotional emptiness after holding too much. That moment where I do everything I need to do, but inside I feel like I've disconnected a little from myself. And it's not coldness. Even if from the outside it can look like it. For me, it's protection. I became someone who learned to shut down when I feel too much, not to show too much, not to give too much affection when I'm tired. Not because I don't feel it, but because giving also costs energy. Because holding other people emotionally while also trying to hold myself eventually leaves me with no space. And then I become more distant, more quiet, more careful with what I say and what I feel. And sometimes even with myself, I treat myself more harshly than I'd like to admit, as if a part of me says, there's no time for this right now, Jessica. And what others might call coldness, it's actually survival for me. I became this way, not overnight, but slowly. In moments where feeling too much wasn't safe, where needing too much felt like a risk, well, being vulnerable didn't always have space. And silence became my way of continuing to function without breaking in front of others. But what no one sees is what happens when I'm alone. When the day ends, when I close the door, when I'm no longer being the strong person for anyone, that's when another version of me appears. A more tired version, a quieter version, a version more disconnected from what I feel. And sometimes I realize something that hurts to admit. I became very good at taking care of everyone else, but I slowly drifted away from what it feels like to receive care. I became emotionally efficient. I can solve, I can continue, I endure, but I don't always stop to feel supported. And that has been a cost, because little by little, I got used to not needing too much out loud, not asking for too much, not taking up too much emotional space. And even though I still show up for everyone else, there are parts of me that don't know how to show up for myself as easily anymore. And not because they don't exist, but because they are tired of having nowhere to rest. And I became very strong, but also very quiet. And that that silence protected me, but it also pulled me away from myself. And now I realize something I don't want to keep ignoring, that surviving like this is not the same as living, and that maybe the part of me that learned to stay quiet in order to not break no longer needs to run my entire life. Then I started noticing something. Every time I said I'm fine, I was actually meaning something else. I meant, I don't have the energy to explain this. I don't want to be a burden. I don't know how to put it into words without falling apart. And I understood something uncomfortable. It wasn't that I had nothing to say. It was that I didn't feel safe saying the truth. And that's when everything shifted, because silence stopped being just a habit and became survival. So I want to ask you something. If someone heard everything you've been carrying, would they understand you? Or would they only understand the version of you that you've learned to show? And what would happen if you didn't have to translate your pain? If you could simply say, this is what really happened to me, without making it smaller, without justifying it, without apologizing it for feeling it. And this episode is not about answers. It is about letting go. It is about stopping the constant need to explain parts of myself that I no longer want to defend. And not because they don't matter, but because I'm tired of having to convince others that they do. And I think that that is also my liberation, not being understood by everyone, but stopping the act of betraying myself just to be understood. Because for a long time, I tried to fit my story into shapes that were easier to hear. I tried to soften myself. I tried to understand myself from the outside. I tried to justify my reactions, my silences, the way I exist. And in that process, I drifted away from myself without even realizing it. There are things I no longer want to keep explaining. And not because I don't have the words, but because I no longer want to live in a place where I constantly have to explain myself in order to be valid. And something important I also need to share here is that in that process, I became more guarded with people, not in a cold or unfeeling way, but in a protective way. I became more observant, more careful, slower to open up, more selective about who gets access to my emotional world. And sometimes from the outside, that can look like distance, like disinterest, like coldness. But in reality, it is history, it is experience, it is learning. Because I learned that not everyone stays. I learned that not everyone holds what they say they will hold. I learned that sometimes you open up and then you have to pick up yourself back up alone. So I started observing more, listening more than I speak, noticing gestures, silences, and consistencies, paying attention to small details that I used to overlook. And yes, I became someone who thinks a lot before trusting, someone who doesn't give themselves away quickly, someone who is not easily moved by pretty words without actions to back them up. And it's not because I don't want connection. It's because I learned how to protect it. Because I learned my emotional energy is not infinite. And I don't want to spend it in places where I don't get the same. In places where I have to keep explaining what I feel just to be considered. In places where I have to ask for the basics more than once. So yes, I became more selective, quieter at first, more observant before opening my heart, and more aware of when something doesn't feel aligned with me. And that can sometimes look like hardness. But for me, it is clarity. It is an attempt not to repeat versions of myself that open too quickly and were left without support. Because there is something no one taught me early enough, that not everyone deserves access to your most vulnerable self. And that learning to observe is not the same as distrusting life. It is learning not to abandon myself again. And yes, I also need to say this honestly. There are moments where I prefer silence. I prefer to listen. I prefer to watch. I prefer to understand the space before filling it with my voice. And not because I don't have anything to say, but because I no longer want to give parts of myself in places where there is no care to receive them. And that has also made me more aware, slower to open up, but firmer when I do. And even if that sometimes makes me seem distant, the truth is I am learning not to give my inner world just to any discomfort, because I have lived enough to understand this, that opening up is not the problem. The problem is opening up without safety, without getting the same thing in return, without real presence on the other side. And that is why I have become this way. Not hard because I feel less, but intentional because I have felt too much without care. And maybe this is the point where I pause and say it without over-explaining. I didn't become cold. I became careful. I didn't fully close off. I learned to observe before I give myself away. I didn't stop trusting people. I learned to do it with more truth, more boundaries, and more respect for myself. And even if that sometimes feels lonely, it is also a way of not losing myself again in places where I used to abandon myself just to belong. And this episode is also that, an attempt to not abandon myself again in the story I am telling. And as always, I want to recommend you a book, and it's called Atlas of the Heart by Brené Brown. It's a book that explores the language of human emotions, how we name what we feel, how we sometimes struggle to distinguish between sadness, disappointment, shame, or emotional exhaustion, and how that lack of language can also lead us to disconnect from ourselves. And I think it connects deeply with this episode because so often we say, I became tougher with people, or I became colder. There are actually more complex emotions underneath that we don't always know how to express. So this book reminds me that naming what we feel is not exaggerating it, it's understanding it. And that very often what looks like distance or coldness is actually a way of protecting a heart that has felt too much without enough space to process it. So I highly recommend it. So if someone heard this, maybe they would understand everything. But maybe the most important question is not whether someone else understands me. The most important question is this: do I understand myself now? Not the version of me that learned how to survive by being strong. Not the version of me that became efficient, functional, that could hold difficult conversations even when inside I was overflowing. But the version of me that is slowly learning not to disappear behind that strength. Because the truth is, I am not perfect, and I never will be. And for a long time, that was hard for me to accept. It was hard to accept that I don't have to have all the answers, that I don't always know how to feel what I feel. That sometimes I shut down, that sometimes I pull away, that sometimes I become more silent than I wish I did, and that all of that is also me. I am learning. I'm getting to know myself in layers I didn't previously allow myself to see, and that is not always comfortable. Sometimes it is confusing, sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's beautiful too, but in a very quiet and gentle way. But today, with all that I am, I want to say thank you. Thank you to everything that I have lived through. Thank you to what even hurt. Because every experience, even though the ones I didn't understand at the time, brought me here. It shaped who I am. It is teaching me who I am becoming. And even though I have not always felt safe inside my own story, today I can look back and recognize that I did the best I could with what I had. And that is enough too. So today I want to deeply thank the series, Recordings That Were Never Meant to Exist of Jessica Lomelin, because in this space, I said things that for a long time stayed inside of me, because I allowed myself to be vulnerable in a way that scared me, because it is not easy to open up like this. It is not easy to say out loud what usually stays in silent, and it is not easy to show yourself without full armor. And still, I did it, and I'm grateful to every person who listened, to every person who stayed, to every person who saw themselves reflected at some point in this process, because this was not just an episode or just a series. It was a way of telling the truth without softening it too much, of stopping the hiding of what I feel, of beginning to trust my own voice a little more. And if I take anything from all of this, it is that I don't have to be strong all the time to be valuable. I don't have to have everything figured out to be enough. And I don't have to be the version of me that never breaks to deserve love, rest, and care. And it scares me to say this because opening up like this is always scary. There is always a part of me that thinks, what if it was too much? What if I shouldn't say this? What if I'm exposing more than I could hold? But I said it anyway, because I think that is also me, the one who feels fear and still keeps going, the one who doubts and still speaks, the one who breaks a little and still tries to meet herself with more tenderness. And maybe that is what I'm learning now. I don't have to stop being who I am in order to revolve. I just have to stop abandoning myself in the process, because we were never only meant to be the ones who hold everything together. We were also meant to be held. And today, for the very first time in a long time, I'm starting to believe that in a more real way. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for listening. Thank you for being with me in this series, in these recordings that maybe were never meant to exist, but that existed because I needed to tell the truth. In the description of this episode, you'll find the Amazon link with the full list of books mentioned in No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet, from the very first episode up until today. And don't forget that every Friday there's a new episode waiting for you. New month, new series. And the July series is called Everything No One Tells You About Growing Up. When we were children, growing up seemed simple. We thought that one day we would have all the answers, that we will know exactly who we are, what we want, and who would stay by our side forever. But no one told us about the quiet grief that comes with adulthood. No one told us that growing up also means saying goodbye to people you love, questioning the beliefs you were raised with, changing your mind about who you are, and discovering that life rarely follows the plan you imagined. So this month, I want us to have the honest conversation about those things that almost no one explained to us. Those experiences that we often go through thinking we are the only ones, when in reality, they are part of how complex and beautiful and sometimes painful growing up really is. And we begin with a question you may have asked yourself more times than you admit. What happens when a friendship ends, but no one did anything wrong? There are friendships that end with a fight, a betrayal, or a clear conversation, but there are others that simply change. The calls become less frequent. The messages take longer to come. You start living different realities. And one day you realize that the person who once knew everything about you is now someone you don't even know how to start a conversation with anymore. And that hurts too, because no one taught us how to grieve a friendship that didn't end from a lack of love, but from the passing of time. No one told us that you can deeply miss someone and at the same time understand that you no longer fit into each other's lives the same way. So this Friday, we're going to talk about those endings without closure, the guilt of growing apart, and the sadness of accepting that some people were home for a season of our lives, and how to make peace with the idea that not all relationships were meant to last forever. Because there are people we miss not because we want them back, but because they were once an important part of who we were. So don't miss it. You were listening to No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet. I'm your host, Jessica Lomelin. Until next time.